Hello. So for this lesson, we're going to be taking a look at V-Ray's render settings, but from an angle of comparing speed versus quality and what settings we need to look at in order for us to have a more positive feedback from our renders. Okay, so why don't we take a look at our asset editor to get things going. Okay, so when we first open up the default settings, they're usually set to interactive or progressive or a combination of the two. So if we just hit the render button, we should get a render window that pops up, and it will start to churn away at a rendering for us. Okay. Now, because it's on progressive, that means it's just going to keep going for a while and progressively get better looking and better looking. But obviously, in the interest of time, we don't want to go about it that way. Okay, so we're just going to stop that for now. And we're going to take a look at what settings we need to concern ourselves with in order to impact our quality versus our speed. Okay, so first thing I want to do is open up the side panel for the asset editor for various settings over here. Okay, now our quality is currently set to medium because it's on progressive, so we're going to shut the progressive off, and I want to set the quality down to draft. And when I do that, I know that's going to give me the basic fastest rendering I can get for the settings as they are. Okay, so if I were to hit the render button just to see how long that's going to take, and it will chug through that pretty quickly, and we will get a result in a few seconds. Okay, so once that's finished, we will get an idea of about how quickly we can get through this rendering with the settings as they are. And according to the readout down here, that took about a little less than 2.5 seconds. Felt a little longer than that to me, but we'll go with that value there. So the first thing that I always change whenever I'm setting up my render settings is I change my primary rays to a radiance map. And I've mentioned this before. The reason being it's faster than brute force, but it's less accurate. And for our purposes, we don't need perfection. We just need things to look good in the shortest amount of time as possible. Okay. The other reason is also the irradiance map has a lot of settings down here which we can adjust in order to speed things up or improve the quality and things of that nature. Whereas with the brute force, we just don't have those options. So the other parameters that we're going to be looking at here, we're going to just pay attention to when I change the quality settings here, that these start to change as well. Okay, so when I'm on the draft setting, things like my noise limiter, the number's fairly high. It's at 0.2, and the irradiance map settings are quite low, and the light cache subdivisions are quite low, and all of these numbers are small. So as this setting goes up, though, you'll see that our noise limit is now cut in half. Our subdivisions for the maximum subdivisions has increased. Our rates here have changed. The subdivisions have gone up, and so on. Our light cache subdivisions have also gone up. Okay, so and as we change these settings to higher quality, you can see these numbers are adjusting to sort of follow suit, to the point when I go all the way up to very high, this number is getting pretty small, and we can never set it to 0 because it's just an impossible number. But the smaller that number gets, approaching 0, the smoother and better looking our renderings will be, but obviously at the expense of time. So similarly, all these other, like the subdivisions, the higher the number goes, the more time it takes to render. Okay, so all of these things have an impact. All right, so what we want to do is try to remember to put certain settings ahead of others when it comes to speed. And the number one impact on speed is going to be our noise limit variable. Okay, so if I put this at draft, as I said, our noise limit goes quite, well, relatively speaking, quite large. And when we want to improve the quality so that there's not as many speckles or flecks or whatever you want to call it, then we need to make this a smaller number. Okay, so just by changing this value here to even the 0.05 setting, that is, oh, I've got two decimals in there, the setting for, I believe it was medium. If I render this now, so that's the only thing I've changed. When I start a rendering, it will have a better look in the end than the draft setting, but of course at the expense of a little bit more time. Okay, so just by setting that number, though, you're going to see how much better the surfaces, especially the large flat surfaces, will tend to look. Okay, and you can see that this is taking a fair amount more time than the last one. Definitely more than 2.5 seconds. As I mentioned, though, I'm a little suspicious of this value here, and since it didn't change any, then I guess that printout here isn't exactly relative to our rendering. But anyhow, so you can see that that does look quite a bit better than our draft setting. You'll also notice that when I change one of these values, and it doesn't matter which one, the quality setting immediately jumps to custom. Okay, so in the interest of just trying to keep things quick, we'll set this back to draft, which means that changes our noise limit, right? Obviously, when we put this up to something like high, some of these values get quite large, especially subdivisions, and some of them we can set back down in the interest of trying to speed things up, but keeping some of the other values. Like, for example, the noise limit, I believe on medium it's 0.05, but on high it's 0.01. So that's literally 5 times less noise. Okay, so if we keep that value, but then start lowering some of these subdivisions and in our irradiance map and our light cache, then we can have an impact on the amount of time that our renderings take. Okay, so basically find some trade-off for your noise limits versus your subdivisions, and you will find that you can have a big influence on how quickly or how smoothly your renderings turn out. Now, one quick note, the denoiser feature, if we turn that on, and I recommend leaving it on the V-Ray one, just because you may not have an NVIDIA video card in your machine. I don't, so that wouldn't make any sense to turn this on, and it would just take more time to do nothing. Okay, so but as we've mentioned in the past, by using very low settings like the drafts, but also having our denoiser turned on, and we can also set some parameters in there if you want to play around with that. Personally, I don't worry about it too much because the results that I get even on the draft setting are quite nice. So if we were to set that to render now, we will see even fewer specks in the surface. Now, it does take a little bit of time at the end of the rendering, but probably not as much time as changing the noise value settings in the original render settings. Okay, so like everything, it's a trade-off. So the more you play around with these numbers and start to get a sense for it, the more you can see that using certain refinements in our settings, we can come up with some pretty decent results. So there we have our denoise filter, and you can see how much smoother the concrete looks. The only thing you have to be careful of is this filter, which is basically what the denoiser is. It guesses at surfaces that it thinks need to be smooth, and those which need to be a little more pixelated. And an example of what I'm talking about might be something like stainless steel. Like if we had a refrigerator in our image here, the denoiser might smooth out the finish on the metal to a point where it doesn't look like metal anymore. So it's the kind of thing that you have to be a little cautious of before just always leaving it turned on. So I tend to leave it turned off simply because that way I know the noise that I'm getting is a result of some of the settings. Okay, so I prefer to set this to some crazy low number and play around with a few of these other values down here in order to influence my renderings even more than just a denoise filter. Okay, so that's basically all I wanted to cover in the speed versus quality settings. Okay, so hopefully that has shown you a few things that will help you produce either faster or better renderings in a short amount of time. So thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks.